Folks, can everyone hear me before I go on? Everybody here? Good. Glad to hear it. I'm waiting for us to get connected with our friends in the classroom. So that should happen any minute now.
I can hear you. Just
awesome. Also realize that if you need to raise your hand, you have that option, of course, on Zoom. If you need to ask any questions, you can do it just like we're in the middle of class too. Okay, I see we're connected. All right, thanks, folks. I appreciate it. I hope your test was not too bad. We're going to finish up everything. Thank you, Ashley.
You're welcome.
Appreciate it very much. So without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and talk about developing a competitive advantage and strategic focus. This is actually kind of a nuts and bolts kind of how-to guide, putting together all of the discussion we had in terms of functioning things that you actually do with your SWOT analysis to think these things through and create a competitive advantage and a strategic focus. So the first thing that we're going to talk about is we're going to kind of talk about how do you develop a competitive strategy. And we're going to talk about the basics of how we started in the very beginning, where we talked about diagnosis and synthesis. And so the breaking apart of the information is the diagnosis. And what the SWOT analysis does is it synthesizes the information together. It brings together the disparate pieces of information and helps us to bring it together in a way that creates a new focus that you may not have thought about before. Just remember this, and this is important, that disruption is a key part of creating innovation. That when you do something new and unique, you are disrupting the way things are. It means that you're going to be setting your own pace. You're going to be working in your own directions, and these things can bring about enormous changes, and the changes hopefully will be in the benefit of your firms. And so what you want to be able to do is not only reinvent outside, but internally as well. So you want to be able to collaborate within your firm, to be able to think in new ways and create the ideas of entirely new markets. And this is one of the advantages of a SWOT analysis. It provides direction. It can serve as a catalyst. It is a way of bringing in facts without filtering the facts from the very first. And that's another good thing, because we have a tendency of filtering things out, thinking that they're not important, but the SWOT analysis helps determine whether they are or not. And so in the very beginning of any idea stage, all ideas are important, and that's why we want to use a SWOT analysis. Many underestimate the value of a SWOT analysis. Just remember this, some of the things that it does for you is it helps you define the things you can do and you cannot do, and the things that you can control and that you cannot. And that is a very valued thing, especially if you use that to your advantage. It helps to uncover competitive advantages that can be leveraged into marketing strategy. And it has these advantages. It's simple. It's not that hard to understand. It doesn't require intensive training. All that it requires is work. And so if you're good workers, if you're someone who's willing to study and to practice, you'll find that SWOT analysis can be very valuable. They're flexible. You can connect structured data together, and you can create those and create future SWOTs and have a longitudinal idea. It allows you to integrate quantitative information and qualitative information, which is sometimes generally difficult. And so when we think about our business week scenario, anyway, the one that we talked about yesterday, that was where you had qualitative information, where we were talking about things going on inside the office, and we had quantitative information when we were talking about profit and loss. All of those things are welcome together. And the last thing that it does is it provides collaboration. It brings varying aspects and perspectives and insights from other departments. And that is extremely important because it's the cross-pollination are the things that bring genuine success. Now, yes, they are more relevant than ever. Whether or not you get any benefits from it, it all comes down to your diligence and your work that you put into it. However, these are general criticisms about SWOTs. It allows you to create lists without any serious considerations to the issues. It sometimes becomes a sterile academic exercise, and as an academician, I kind of resent that, but it can just be a way of classifying data and putting it in formation, but not really doing anything with it. And the only way that I can say that is, well, yeah, but so are a lot of other things. It all comes down to the focus of the users, whether or not the SWOT is valued or whether it's not. So, how do we make a SWOT productive? What's the way that we do that? Well, the first thing that we note is that one generic SWOT is just simply not enough. You can't create a SWOT analysis for Walmart, let's say, or Procter & Gamble, where you have multiple divisions and multiple products. Usually good SWOT analysis focus on product and market combinations, such as trucks, cars, SUVs, electric vehicles. Those are the kinds of divisions and products and markets and the combinations that you have to make. The next is that you should not only look at yourself, but you should create SWOTs of your competitors. You should look at your customers. You should look at your external market. Each one of those, if you use a SWOT, you'll be able to gain insight once again, because they're collaborative ways of bringing that information together. And the last is that you should only complete one SWOT if the organization only has one product and one market. And so the first thing to do is to stay focused, all right? The next is you must be an extensive searcher for competitors. You must look out and consider all of the competitors that are out there. You cannot simply focus on the brand competitors, but you need also to look at the product, the generic, and the total budget competitors. You cannot be myopic or dismissive. The classic example, in which I will give again, is Microsoft simply being unwilling to branch out into another field, a field that was going to be developed regardless of whether they were in it or not. But the fact that they did not put themselves in the game, in essence, meant the game was developed and framed by someone else. One of the things also that's important to understand when you're talking about a first mover advantage, one of the enormous advantages that Apple got from having a tablet out on the market first was that they set the rules of what a tablet is supposed to be. In other words, A tablet is supposed to have a touch screen. A tablet supposed to have a certain number of buttons, even though Steve Jobs hated it. I find it fascinating that Steve Jobs said if we ever go to a pencil, then the iPad, in essence, no longer is useful. And of course, my daughter has an iPad pencil and she uses it exclusively. I have my Samsung phone here, and my little Samsung phone has a pencil. So he's not all right all the time. But here's the thing. Because they were first in the game, they were the ones who set the rules. It's why Google had to go back. It's why there are no clamshells. Excuse me, the Surface Pro now has a clamshell version, but they could have set that 10 years ago, all right? So the second thing, search extensively for competitors. A classic and sad example is a company called Mattress Firm. That was their name. They had 3,300 retail locations in the United States and did not see what was coming from overseas, notably China and the dumping of lesser priced mattresses. You also had direct-to-consumer brands such as Purple, and Lisa, and they came on with such incredible things like 10-year warranties, which almost is superfluous. 10 years. I mean, who's going to stick around for that long? Well, unfortunately, Mattress Firm did not match them. And ultimately what happened was they went out of business. A very valuable asset is to collaborate with other functional areas in your organization. One of the reasons that I do arbitrary groups like I do is that I would like to make sure that there's an eclectic mix. In other words, totally arbitrary, because each individual in a group has their own unique strengths and weaknesses. And in the same token, in the real world, all of you are going to be collaborating with people that you don't choose anyway. But that's not a bad thing, all right? Supply chain and logistics, well, supply chain, is that a bad word? Marketing and sales, management, HR, they all need to be together because they all have a very dynamic impact when all of those are collaborated together. So, I'm going to show you something real quick. So, does anybody recognize what that is? It's the tail end of a plane. Anybody want to guess where it came from? This is the Dark Star in Top Gun Maverick. Now, you see that funny little skunk on the end? That's actually a real thing, okay? That funny little skunk is from Lockheed Martin's Advanced Development Program, the ADP. That symbol is what's known as the Skunk Works. So what is the Skunk Works? Well, the Skunk Works is a separate division of Lockheed that brings together disparate groups inside Lockheed's organization. They give them a ton of money, and they totally disconnect them from any other responsibilities. In other words, they're free to create. The original Skunk Works came about in 1949. There was a cartoon by the name of Little Abner that had a factory that was known as the Skunk Works Factory. And apparently they took skunks and old shoes and were creating something that was disgusting. The first Skunk Works, or first collaboration place that Lockheed got together to develop their advanced tactical fighter of the time, ultimately that became the SR-73 and the U-2, was a very secret organization, and it was put into a chemical factory that stunk, okay? So they were putting together these programs, Kelly Johnson and the others in there, and they were very secretive when they would answer their phone calls. So somebody called them up, and the guy answered the phone with Skunk Works, and that's how the name stuck. Skunk Works now is, how do I put this? It has evolved into a symbol of excellence. If you see Skunk Works on the tail of any plane, you know that it was part of the Advanced Systems Division of Lockheed. This is a great example of how collaboration comes together and really builds brilliant stuff, okay? So the next time you watch Top Gun Maverick, look for the skunk. It's got to be my favorite part of it when he goes flying over Ed Harris. Okay, so Starbucks has a new product development system in the same way. It's cross-functional teams. They work with store managers and baristas. They find ways of creating unique combinations. The Dodge brothers, when they created their own Skunk Works in 1909, 1910, they basically brought anyone in who would like to work after hours. They could use any tools that they needed. The Dodge brothers fed them. They also had a doctor on staff there. So they took care of all of their things, and then Dodge became very successful. The Dodge truck, or the myth of the Dodge truck of how great it was, came about from those Skunk Works and new product developments, just because they gave them the place to do those things. The next thing is that you need to examine the issues from the customer's perspective, all right? It's important to understand from the customer's eye that while everything may be valued, it may not necessarily be valued in the customer perception. So you may want to know what customers and non-customers perceive or believe that their products are so valuable. So what are their opinions about the customer service, the price, the experience that they're going through? How do the external trends in the environment impact the customers and in the use of their products, especially when it comes to recycled materials? These are all important things, and we need to consider the customer's views and how those affect the employees as well when we're coming up with a SWOT. Now, having said that in such a way, we also have to make sure to know that really the customers may provide you with information, but it may be just enough to get you in serious trouble, all right? Sometimes you have to look and see what's going on behind the curtain to know whether or not a job or a characteristics is important. And so you have to look for beyond just merely what the symptom is, but you have to look at what the characteristics or why is behind it. It can be descriptive, but it doesn't necessarily be constructive. And that's one of the things that we have to be very careful when we look at these particular items. We must separate internal issues from external ones. The way that we do this is we ask the question of everything. Would this issue exist if the firm didn't? In other words, is this an outside issue that is independent of my organization, or is it something related inside the organization itself? And that is a very key thing that you have to understand. The last thing is that you need to adopt a disruptive mindset. You have to be willing to change the rules of the game if you're going to achieve success. Right side thinking is the current way that business is done. It is the way that it is accepted now. If we're to succeed, we need to do two different things, and I'll show you this in a diagram in a minute. One of them is called upside down thinking, and the other is called outside in thinking. So what is upside down thinking? Upside down thinking looks at our current strengths and sees if they could be transformed into weaknesses. In other words, we see the other side of what's behind the curtain. Is there a Achilles heel to this particular advantage that we have? And if we can find that, then ultimately it might change fundamentally how we consider our strengths. The next is we need to look at our weaknesses and see how we can transform them into strengths. Is there something that we're doing right now that is failing in the mind of our consumers, but with just a little bit of a change, we might be able to make some effect that makes consumers value it. The last is what's known as outside-in thinking. Outside-in thinking looks at the upside-down thinking, not in our organization, but in our competitors' organizations. And so one of the most valued things that we can know is the strengths and weaknesses of the people that we're trying to compete with. And if we know their strengths and weaknesses, and we approach the upside-down approach when we think of them, we might find chinks in their armor. We might find places that they're not satisfying the consumers that we have the resources to do. The last thing in this discussion part, I want to show you excuse me. So, if any of you remember The Matrix, when it came out, they had this phrase. Anybody know what it means? Okay. The phrase is Greek. The Greeks said this was the way that we can achieve peace and success in our life. Tenet nosce means know thyself. All right? This is in essence what the SWOT analysis hopefully performs. It helps you to know yourself. And that not only means knowing yourself, but knowing your competitors. And so this is the purpose and the function of the SWOT analysis, to help you know yourself. All right. So let us move on. And before we go on, I'd like us to think of Uber and Lyft. And for those of you who can remember a time when Uber and Lyft did not exist, and it'll be one of your cases, for any of you who would have ever wanted to be a cabbie, I don't know if you ever knew it, especially in New York, the test costs $100,000 to be able to take. It requires 6 months of study, and it requires you to know every street within inside the 5 boroughs of New York. Now, just imagine what it takes to be a cabbie there. It's a lot more than you think. Uber and Lyft, however, came up with such an incredibly brilliant situation that to connect a GPS system with cab services, that it makes you wonder why no one thought of it in the first place. This is truly a disruptive technology. It used independent contractors who weren't employees. It did all the heavy lifting in the mine for you, and in essence, fundamentally changed the way we look at things forever. And so, using this as a backdrop, we can kind of move to thinking about how we go about doing strategic planning using the SWOT. So here we are with our SWOT, broken down just as we expect. So we look at those things that are internal in origin, those attributes of the organizations, which are our strengths and our weaknesses. We look at those things that are external, and those would be opportunities and threats. And of course, the strengths and the opportunities are helpful in achieving our objective, and the weaknesses and threats are harmful in achieving our objectives. One question that invariably I get asked is, can something be a strength and the weakness? And my answer is Absolutely. Anything can be a strength and a weakness. It's very possible that you can list something in both categories, just depending on the situation that's involved. And so, yes, you can. So if we were going to look at some of the potential issues, and we're looking at them, strength, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. So strengths would be abundant financial resources. You have a respected company brand. You have enormous economies of scale. You have brand advocates. In other words, you have customers that are what are known as marketing mavens. These are individuals who become, cheerleaders for your particular firm. And then you can have organizations that tend to be agile. In other words, they can handle disruptions. Weaknesses can be just a simple lack of strategic direction. I think Microsoft, even though they thought they had a direction, was a little bit confused at one time. Limited financial resources without going on can be the number one weakness to any organization. Let me also say this. Too much financial resources can be a weakness as well, because you think that you're invulnerable to anything that can come down the pipe. Ain't so, all right? Lack of focus on disruptive technologies, the concern that Microsoft had to protect their past. Opportunities, the market is growing rapidly. You have firms that are complacent, that are fat and sassy, are happy where they are. They don't want to grow any further. There are consumers' needs and tastes that are changing. And so the classic example I give is Mothers Against Drunk Driving and their ability to change and to focus forever. New products and new processes that are out there. And then finally, the external threats. The external threats, basically, if you want to categorize it, is what are the things that can knock me out tomorrow, that can put me out of business? And so if you notice, changing customer needs and tastes are also a threat as well as an opportunity. And that is a difficult thing. The product life cycle in decline is always a danger there. And sometimes with technology moving so rapidly, we don't know when a product is in growth or maturity or decline. And so you always have to be cognizant of some of the early warning symbols, like a lowering of the number of competitors, the difficulty in losing market share. Those are some of the things that we have to think of when we're talking about threats. So in strengths and weaknesses, a strength, that third bullet point is important. A strength that is support of a customer's need is what's known as a capability, all right? And so you have the capability of satisfying a customer's need, and that becomes extremely valuable as a strength. It's not just a resource that you have that's available, it's a resource that's directly connected to a customer's needs. The relationships that employees have with customers, if you're a customer-focused organization, all of these can help build a strategic competitive advantage. In other words, that one thing that you can do better than anyone else can. So I talked about this 2 days ago, I believe, and I will talk about it again. Many of the larger carriers have problems quite simply because they're big. And they have broad focuses that aren't narrowly defined. So as I said before, Delta Airline has 29 different airframes. And I want you to imagine the difficulty of a mechanic who works for Delta having to go through 29 separate manuals, especially in an aging air fleet where there may be a dozen permutations of the same vehicle. They may have new engines. They may have new command centers. There are all sorts of things that change. However, you look at a corporation, like I said, like Southwest, which has one airframe, which is the 767. Now, they've gone through their issues, especially with the Dash 8 MAX. but that's a problem with Boeing, but not necessarily with themselves. Those things can become restrictions and limitations, but they can also become strengths as well, because it allows them to focus on a single unique customer. Frontier Airlines, I don't know if you've ever flown with Frontier. My brother does quite a bit. They're not out of every, every airport. But what's amazing at Frontier is that they will run ridiculous promotions. And if you're one of those individuals who can fly on a moment's notice, he flew to Denver 2 weeks ago and it cost him $50 round trip. No lie. Now, the problem with that, of course, is you have to be an individual who can fly at a moment's notice, and there's not that many people out there. But these are examples of strategic advantages built around their assets. Opportunities and threats are those things that exist outside the firm and that are uncontrollable. You have no ability to affect change. These usually occur in political, legal, technological, social, and cultural environments. That trends change in both technology and the way that consumers do things, and they can be momentous, they can be advantageous, but they can be disastrous at the same time. So you want to take advantage of the opportunities and you want to minimize the threats. So let me give you a great example. For those of you who can remember, Blockbuster used to be a way of life. Every Friday, usually at 5 o'clock, there would be in front of the Blockbuster, there would be lines, I swear to you, running out, getting this week's DVD or the VHS tape. Blockbusters were more than just merely places to rent DVDs. They were places where you could buy candy and popcorn. They usually had the latest premieres running at the same time. They dominated their particular industry, but something came along to cut into their dominance, and it was a little red box called Redbox. Okay, so Redbox premiered in 2000, 2001, 2002, and it kind of focused consumers on what do they really want. It turns out that the popcorn and the candy and all the other stuff were just ancillary. They were things that people were getting while they were there. What they really wanted was more locations to rent, and the red boxes could be put on any street corner. Matter of fact, you can put 2 red boxes next to each other. And so that was the initial thing that cut into their particular market. And at the same time, Netflix was premiering with their DVD by mail. And so you had a subscription service with Netflix, like $5 a month. You could rent as many DVDs as you wanted, but you could only rent them 1 at a time, or you could rent them 2 at a time. But as soon as you got the DVD, you mailed it back in the mailer. As soon as they got the mailer back, they'd mail you the next one. That was the other thing that started breaking the mold in the weekends kind of DVD things. Netflix's real big thing was when high-speed access, DSL, started coming out in 2005, 2006, and they jumped on it because they were early to be in the streaming market, and now here they are, and now they're fighting with every other streamer out there, and you can see that even that has finally reached a saturation point. So if we remember, we say being careful of a threat in a market in decline, this is one of those. So I want you to pay attention to this slide. You may have to draw it for the test, but whether you do or not, this slide is very valuable, okay? So what does this say? This is the actionable things that you do when you're working with your SWOT matrix. So 4 corners: strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. The arrows tell you how to perform the functions once you build a SWOT analysis. If you have weaknesses, you want to try to find a way of converting them to strengths. If you have threats, you want to try to find ways of creating them to become opportunities. In upside down thinking, what it says for us to do is to think across the strengths and weaknesses and try to convert them, change them, and use them as ways of creating ideas to create new chances, new strengths. The horizontal lines, you want to match opportunities and strengths together. If you have a very good supply chain, you want to be able to use the opportunities that are out there right now for more efficient shipping. If you have threats and weaknesses that cannot be converted, you want to be able to minimize them or avoid them. Now, how do you minimize those things? Mostly by trying to focus on the things that you can control. And then the last of them, the access disruption, this is the outside-in thinking of how we think of our competitors and how we can think of their strengths and weaknesses and how we can take advantage of them. And so this is the process that synthesis hopefully will bring us. It will help us to aid in the transition to create a strategic focus. You need to address every opportunity and strength and weakness that you can, but you have to be aware of some key things. You have to offer solutions, all right? You have to offer solutions to the customers because solutions become capabilities. And success depends on your ability to create capabilities by matching your strengths with opportunities. Remember, the opportunity usually represents some significant need that consumers have. You want to be able sometimes, if you can, to convert weaknesses by investing within key areas in your organization to be able to match those things in some success. And so if a weakness that you have is a lack of knowledge, you want to invest in more employee training. If you can't deliver goods in time, you need to invest in more efficient supply chains or channels. Remember that if you can't transform a strength, it becomes a limitation. And yes, you may have to live with it. And remember, as I showed in the previous slide, strengths and weaknesses should be flipped. Strength to weaknesses, weaknesses to strength, because remember, we're all into disruption. We want to change the status quo. We want to make things different. And the opportunities and threats should be assessed to determine the competitor's strengths and how they may become weaknesses. Now, I want to just say something briefly here about quantitative analysis. This may be one question. One of the things that you also need to do is quantify the magnitude of each element. We did not do that the last time, but how strongly can these things affect the firm can be very valued ultimately in measuring whether or not this is a potential danger that can ultimately disrupt your organization. And so this is an example of a drug, and what we were looking at is we were looking at the magnitude of that element and its importance, and then giving it a total rating. So at the end of all of this, you have to recognize strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats, and try to understand which ones have the greatest influence on you. Are you high in opportunities? Are you low in threats? Are you low in strength and high in weaknesses? Those are important things for us to try to measure. And I'll show you later what that ultimately means and how we do that. So now we developed our SWOT analysis. We've made our decisions about what's valued and what's not. And now what we're trying to do is we're trying to develop competitive advantages based upon the SWOT. So what is a competitive advantage? As I've said over and over again, a competitive advantage is something unique within your organization that is not easily replicated by your competitors, all right? These things can be real, these things can be imagined, but as long as they are believed by the consumer to be valued, they're valuable to us, okay? And so what we want to do is to develop a disruptive mindset and find compatibility between our strengths and our opportunities. If I serve the customer better than the competition, it's a competitive advantage. Starbucks, don't get me wrong, I don't like waiting in line, but I will freely admit it is a great cup of coffee, hands down. McDonald's, it's a good cup of coffee, but let me also say this, I can get it in 30 seconds. That is an advantage to me. Those are unique competitive advantages in the same organization, and each one of them provides a different value for each consumer. So what are sources of competitive advantage? You don't have to go into this. I mean, there's a lot of these things that you simply know. You can have great relationships with your particular consumers. You can have certain advantages legally that you can do. You may have patents and trademarks. You might have unique zoning laws. You may be a great global trader. Those things, you may know the insides that nobody else know, and that would be a legal advantage. You can have a unique special organization. You can have modern plants and equipment. You can have a culture and a vision that is considered organizational advantages that nobody else has. You can have superior talent in human resources. You can have a great culture and a skilled labor force that churns out good things over and over again. You can have an iPad. You can have an iPhone. You can have the watch. You can have unique products that are so specialized that they simply can't be replaced. One of the more unique companies to me has always been Honda. Honda has been a target-focused organization that I never see much around looking at their customers, but boy, they build great stuff. What can I say? You can have lower production costs. You can be a corporation like Texas Instrument that simply wants to produce market share, and they always sell at the lowest cost possible. You can have a great sales force. You can have brilliant people in that organization in terms of sales. And then finally, you can have the best distribution system possible. Think Walmart. And these are all what are considered competitive advantages. Competitive advantages are real differences. However, your perception matters just as much as anything else, all right? The perception that the iPad is better than others, I will argue quite simply, is because they established the standard because they were first. I think if Microsoft would have come out with the Courier, it would be a much different world than we have now. But that's just me, okay? So 3 strategies for competitive advantage are operational excellence, product leadership, and customer intimacy. And let's look at those one at a time. Operational excellence just means you have one of the best, most efficient organizations that are out there. You have scratched your pen to a fine point and do things better than anyone else does. Walmart, all right? Let me give Walmart their due, especially when it comes to distribution, better than anyone else. Walmart in 1994 decided they were never going to dry ship again. Dry shipping means that a truck is rolling across the United States with nothing in it. Walmart, through their computer systems, have made sure that no truck that is rolling on the road in the United States is doing so without something inside of it. Now, operational excellence, spit it out, Dave, can rule as long as the customer's needs are addressed. As long as you're making them happy, everything is fine. But if you're using them as a shortcut, especially when it comes to safety and equality, you're in a bad place, and you've got to be very careful. And so, once again, what helps Walmart is quite simply is they have great prices, at reasonable costs for only the goods they focus in. I want you to also notice that Walmart doesn't invest in refrigerators or what we call white goods or dishwashers. And the reason for that is that's an entire section of their organization service that they simply don't want to deal with. And as long as they stay within their sphere, they're fine. Operational excellence. The next is product leadership, excelling in technology and product development. Apple, at the time of Steve Jobs' death, spent 10% of their profit on research and development. 10%. Think of that number for a minute. It was this commitment to R&D that made them who they are today. Now, I love how they say Microsoft dominates personal computing operating systems. Yeah, but, okay, it's how you define computing operating systems and office productivity. I will give them their due. They definitely do that when it comes to Microsoft Office, all right? For those of you who don't know, Apple was about 6 months from bankruptcy when Steve Jobs came back in 1994, I believe. And when Steve Jobs sat in that chair, he was given a gift of $120 million by Bill Gates. Why? Because there's no such thing as a free lunch. Simple as this. Bill Gates was allowed to port Microsoft Office over to the Macintosh platform. That's what he bought that for, all right? Before then, Apple had their own multi-platform software, that productivity software that was called AppleWorks. What basically Steve Jobs did was he traded that so that he could be able to get the money to survive. Thank God he did, okay? So that's one of the unique characteristics. Let me also say this about Steve Jobs. In 2009, Apple produced all their own chips, by the way. I don't know if you know that. They produced all of their own CPUs. They found that quite simply they couldn't keep up with, Intel. And in 2009, Steve Jobs announced that Apple would no longer produce their own chips and they would focus on the Intel processor. Now, let me tell you what that did for Apple. It did two things. One of them is it never had to focus on research and development on hardware to that extent ever again. The second thing that it did was it meant that you could run Apple products natively on a PC. If anybody doesn't know, there's a program called BlueStacks. If you want to look it up for your PC, I have BlueStacks on my machine, and I can run Apple software on my PC. Conversely, you can run Microsoft products or the Microsoft operating system PC software on the Apple in native mode without having to use it as a software processor. So give Steve Jobs credit. He was stubborn to the end until he didn't have to be. and he was willing to change. The last is customer intimacy, and this is simply knowing your customers better than anyone else. You try to develop long-term relationships. You seek their input on how to solve problems. You're willing to listen to your customers because your customers are the portal to the next great idea. And so customer intimacy goes a long way, especially when you're talking about soft-skilled corporations like Nordstrom and Ritz-Carlton. Those are the kinds of corporations that thrive. So we have these things we're doing. We've gone through our SWOT analysis. Now what we have to do is think about our strategic focus. What is how do we model ourselves in our firm, and how do we implement the strategy? Well, a lot of this has to do ultimately with the results of our SWOT analysis, okay? So in coming up with a competitive advantage, we have to consider the direction that we're going to go. And so we have 4 ways that we can develop this depending on our strengths and our opportunities and our weaknesses and our threats. So if we have many strengths, many strengths and many opportunities, we will be aggressive. Many strengths, many opportunities. It may be potentially the greatest scenario. You match your strengths with your opportunity and you pursue expansion and growth. You look for new products in new markets and you, in essence, reshape the landscape. Surprise, surprise. This is where Apple lives. Apple is always aggressive. And they're the ones who come out with many of these things, all right? Aggressive, many strengths, many opportunities. The next is many strengths, but many external threats. This is where you diversify. You have a lot to offer, but you're limited by external factors. You want to have a diversified portfolio. You have many strategic business units because guess what? The sun don't shine every day. And so you're going to have to be able to have more than one profit center to be able to handle everything. And so not surprised that if you look in this list here, look at all of them that have to deal with the tobacco market. Philip Morris, John Middleton, all of these are in that particular area. Look where Philip Morris Capital went. They went to aircrafts, power plants, real estate. RJR bought Nabisco. They diversified because the markets basically were so threatening that they had to find some way of diversifying the risk. So aggressive, diversify. The next is turnaround. We have many internal weaknesses, but we have many external opportunities. One of the amazing things, so when the Dodge brothers in 1905, Ford opened his first factory, and in 2 years it bombed out. There was a guy by the name of Henry Leland who basically bought the dregs of what Henry Ford had, and he invested in the Dodge brothers and in 1 or 2 organizations to go through and liquidate the corporation. Well, like this, they had many internal problems, but there were enormous opportunities, especially in the automobile market at that time. And so what they said was, perhaps you shouldn't liquidate, perhaps you should restructure. You actually have many things that are in your advantage. You do have debt, but there is a way of structuring this into a long-term solution. So Henry Leland took that Ford organization. He decided to name it after the Native American chief in the Detroit area, and he renamed the company Cadillac, and Cadillac is where it is now. And so what you try to do is right the ship before all goes wrong. And hopefully what you can do is survive and go further. And so J.C. Penney, unfortunately, is in one of those positions. J.C. Penney was basically an organization that shot itself in the foot. They got the chief designer of the Apple iWatch. I have no idea why they offered him the job. And they wanted to create basically a new framework for J.C. Penney. Well, the problem with that is that J.C. Penney, the average consumer, and you got to be very careful about averages, but the individual who did the most shopping in J.C. Penney's were career professional women from the ages of 30 to 55 who made anywhere from 60 to 150,000 a year. And when they restructured J.C. Penney, they functionally took itself out of its own market, and they created their own issues. So J.C. Penney is kind of getting out of that. Hopefully they have been. They may find success later. GNC has the same difficulties as well. Krispy Kreme, unfortunately, their product model is simply not built to be sustainable everywhere. So there's one closed in Boone, there's one closed in Lenore, there's one still moving on in Hickory. So there's still the possibility for turnaround. And the last, which is when you have many internal weaknesses and many internal threats, is finally you're just trying to hang around. You're overwhelmed by internal and external problems, declining mail traffic. You may or may not recover. You're just going to see if you can make it. Radio Shack, unfortunately, is a product of their own issues. Radio Shack in the 90s bet their farm on cell phones, and they grew exponentially. Radio Shack did. But the problem is that it became 40% of all of their income. Anybody who knows, and anybody, of course, when you've gone through the cell phones initially, just all of the paperwork that it takes. And what was happening was the individuals who would come into Radio Shack that would want to be able to ask someone about particular products was never serviced, and unfortunately, they never came back. What also happened is the cell industry within the Radio Shacks semi-collapsed. You started seeing franchise stores by AT&T and all the rest. And then that major asset they had, no longer was viable. And so Radio Shack, in an era of do-it-yourself where it should be glowing, is hanging on by their bare toenails right now. They're actually working online. They're trying to get back. And I'm one of those that hopes they succeed. Okay, so these are your strategic focuses. So now let's talk about how to set objectives and goals. So as I've already talked about it before, goals and objectives are desired accomplishments. Objectives are specific quantitative benchmarks to gauge progress. There are 4 considerations that you have to have when you're coming up with a goal. The first is you have to be able to attain it. You have to be realistic. You can't expect to be able to get 80% of the market. It does not connect with your employees. You can't expect your employees to be able to go out there and work for impossible goals. And so you have to be able to motivate your employees and they have to be goals that your employees can possibly achieve. The next is that they have to be consistent across departments, okay? So if you want to increase sales and market share, that's consistent with customer service and sales. You can do those things, all right? If you try to increase customer satisfaction by always being in stock, and your goal is to reduce inventory, then that is inconsistent. They have to be mutually supportive of each other. Otherwise, it's not reasonable, okay? Comprehensive, I should say, I'm using the word parsimonious again, but what you want to be able to do is that each department where those goals mean something, they should have their own goals matching as well. And so marketing should work on the demand side of the supply chain. You monitor customer needs and you watch internal trends. The research and development has to be on the supply side, looking at the information that marketing brings to create opportunities for new products that will satisfy the consumer needs. And so this is what comprehensiveness means, is that both sides, or let's just say all sides of the equation, are working together to achieve a common goal. And remember, is that the goal is an outcome that the organization hopes to achieve, and it tends to be intangible in ways. The best trained sales force, all right? The most creative in an advertising campaign. It tends to be intrinsic in value and not extrinsic in nature, all right? It does have to be a little fuzzy in ways, but it is not what I would consider to be concrete. An objective is, it is specific, it is measurable, it is quantitative. They should, and once again, they are consistent with everything else, as I've said. You have to be able to attain them. They have to be building on past objectives. As I've said before, they have to be a measured time frame. And you have to assign tasks of those people in your organization, and they need to be responsible for achieving those goals. So just a few last things to wrap up. Companies don't fulfill goals automatically through wishing and hoping. You have to have actionable things that you're doing. The goals must lead to the establishment of consistent goals. There are many times when organizations have to be rebuilt from scratch, that you have to start over, that there has to be a year one. And that is one of the things when you're first starting any organization and you're starting it from scratch, this is one of those things that you ultimately have to do. Okay, folks, I've run out of breath and I've run out of words. I will post this up on this afternoon. I know I ran through that pretty quickly, but I wanted to make sure you had all of that. This recording will be up. So if we go over Monday, like I said, I'm going to start the test maybe 10 or 15 minutes late so that I give everybody a chance to go through their notes quickly. But so we'll start at perhaps 11:45 is when I'll walk in with the test. Feel free to stay as long as you wish. If they close the College of Business, we'll sit outside and do it that way, okay? All right, is there anything else? Anybody, what else to say?
Will
All
the
right,
test,
pardon me?
will the test only cover the chapters and no additional readings?
They will cover that and the process of innovation. So the article by Robertson, that article and the discussion, especially when it comes to innovation, that'll be valued. And then also the diffusion of innovation from the individuals starting all the way to the laggards, okay?
All right, thank you.
You're welcome. Okay, folks, thank you. I appreciate it. I hope you all have a great weekend. Just send me an email if there's anything else you need to know. Is there anything? Oh, Armin, did you have a question?
Yes, Dr. Schultz. I was wondering what topics we should focus on to be prepared for the essay questions.
Essay questions, excellent questions. I would certainly look at the SWOT analysis. I think those are important. I think when you look at the list, things that are generally there are going to be valued as well. I would like you to know innovations and, you know, classifying a particular item as to whether it's an innovation or not. I have not finished with the essay questions right now. Give me just a quick. It will be important that you'll know the differences between data analytics and insights. Definitely know the internal customer and external environments. Know which one is the biggest or the toughest. Know competitive advantages and know how to stage or do competitive analysis too. Let's see, I don't have chapter 2 in front of me right now, but remember how to develop competitive strategies. Certainly what I went through the last one, what I just talked about is know the directions that you need to take your SWOT analysis in terms of a strategic focus. That'll certainly be invaluable. Realize this last chapter is about the processing of information, using it to create a focus, using the focus to be able to use to your advantage, and what are the guardrails in coming up with successful ideas. Anything else? You can shoot me any other questions that you want, folks. If anything, like I said, have a great weekend. We'll have the test on Monday, and we'll start on the last chapters 5, 7, and 10 on Tuesday, okay? All right, folks, have a great weekend. I'll see you.